Welcome to our course on the English novel. This course will be an introduction to the form and history of novelistic fiction in Britain. As such, it'll give us a chance to explore the most popular and influential literary form of the last 250 years. And our first point might just be that the novel is ubiquitous. Novels are sold in airports, grocery stores, and pharmacies. They're also recommended to us by friends, teachers, and now even talk show hosts. It's hard to imagine how we could ever get away from them. The novel is also important. Novels have helped to shape Western understandings of human society and human psychology. If you believe, for example, that society is complex and interconnected, or if you think that your personality has been shaped by early childhood experience, you may owe some of your most basic intellectual assumptions to the novel. Novels are not the only sources of such ideas. Thinkers like Rousseau, Marx, and Freud also come to mind, but they are the most popular and probably the most influential. In this lecture and the next one, we'll review some of the defining features of the novel form and the English novel tradition in particular. We'll want to get a sense of what might be called the Englishness of the English novel. After that, we'll proceed chronologically, tracing the historical development of the English novel from its beginnings in the 1740s to what may be its culmination in the 1920s. Along the way, we'll consider some of the most interesting characters and authors in the history of English literature. Our authors will include Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding from the 18th century, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and George Eliot from the 19th century, and D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf from the 20th century. No prior acquaintance with these authors or their works will be assumed. Now, in preparing a course like this one, scholars and teachers can find it difficult to decide which authors ought to be included. There's certainly a case to be made for including writers like Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stories. Nevertheless, most scholars would agree that the English novel tends to focus on private and personal matters, usually the choice of a husband or wife. So despite the popularity of science fiction and mystery stories, the most appropriate subject for this course is the work of writers like Austen, Eliot, and Woolf. Though we will devote most of our time to literary matters, our approach to the novels will be multidisciplinary, taking in biographical and historical issues as well. We will see that the rise of the novel through the 18th and 19th centuries coincides with a number of major historical developments. These developments include urbanization, the shift of populations from the country to the city, industrialization, the transformation of the British economy from agriculture to manufacturing and trade, and democratization, the growing extension of voting rights to the middle and working classes, and then eventually to women as well. As we turn to the novelists of the 20th century, we will see that their works were also influenced by historical forces, including those associated with the First World War. Having reviewed the basic outlines of our course, let's devote the rest of this opening lecture to some obvious questions. First, what is a novel? How should we define that term? And second, how should we distinguish the novel from other forms of writing? Definitions and distinctions. Literary terminology is always slippery, and the problem is especially serious in the case of the novel. From the end of the 17th century through the end of the 18th century, the term novel was used in a variety of ways. To make matters worse, closely related terms like romance and history were also in a state of flux. Take, for example, Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, published in 1749. We now describe that book as a novel. Indeed, we feel that it's not only a great novel, but also an important one, a book that helped to set the stage for the form's later development. The problem is that Fielding saw it very differently. He could have described Tom Jones as a novel. The term was in use at the time, but he didn't, choosing instead to describe the work as a history. Now, that description doesn't make any sense to us since Tom Jones is not a real person. How can a work of fiction possibly qualify as history? I think it's possible to sort out this sort of problem and arrive at some useful and reliable generalizations about the novel form and its differences from other forms. But I wouldn't turn to textbooks and dictionaries for the answer. Most textbooks tell us that a novel is a work of fiction usually written in prose, at least 150 to 200 pages long. In this way, the textbooks help us to distinguish novels as works of fiction from biographies, memoirs, or histories. The textbook definition also distinguishes novels as works written in prose from classical epics. The Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid are all very long poems, after all. And the textbooks suggest some of the differences between novels and short stories or novellas. Because the novel is a long form, it can cover a period of years, following characters through a very long course of development. Similarly, because the reading time of a novel may be far longer than the running time of most plays or movies, novels give us an opportunity to develop a close, even intimate relationship with both the characters and the narrator. The same thing can happen with a long-running TV series, and that's one reason why shows like Upstairs, Downstairs or The Sopranos are sometimes described as novelistic. In the end, however, the textbooks don't really take us as far as we might like to go. The textbook definition is just too broad. There are too many long works of prose fiction that we wouldn't want to classify as novels, and we need some solid basis for excluding them. Instead of looking to the textbooks, then, let's look at a juicy example from a relevant text. We'll be doing this sort of thing throughout our course, so we might as well get started right away. Our example comes from a work called Love in Excess, or The Fatal Enquiry. This work was written by Eliza Haywood and published in 3 parts from 1719 to 1720. It was very popular at the time. Indeed, it was the best-selling work of fiction published in England between 1700 and 1740. Haywood's own life remains something of a mystery. Our best guess is that she was born around 1693. The first biographical record of Haywood shows her acting in a theatre in Dublin. Other early records suggest that by the time she was 26 or 27, she had had 2 children and was raising them both on her own. Haywood was an incredibly prolific writer, that much we do know. In the decade following her breakthrough with Love in Excess, she wrote a novel on average every 3 months. She had other gifts as well. She seems to have stopped writing fiction in the 1730s and early 1740s, shifting her attention back to the theater, where she worked as both an actor and a writer. She was known to Fielding and probably also to Richardson, and she was satirized by the Augustan poets Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. In the 1740s, Haywood produced the first English magazine by and for women. The magazine ranged widely, covering politics, science, literature, and fashion. She resumed writing fiction about the same time, producing the work for which she's now best known, The History, there's that word again, of Miss Betsy Thoughtless in 1751, a few years before her death in 1756. As her work on the magazine may suggest, Haywood was one of a number of women writers active in this period. We may sometimes think of the great 19th century women writers, Austen, the Brontes, Eliot, as pioneers, but the trail was actually blazed by people like Haywood at least a century before. Haywood's Love in Excess offers a perfect occasion for further reflection on the meaning of the term novel. For one thing, it meets the definition given in the textbooks. It is a work of fiction in prose, about 230 pages long. What's more, it's identified on the title page, presumably by the author, as a novel. If you look there, you'll see plain as day, Love in Excess, or The Fatal Enquiry, a novel. And that's where things get really interesting, because no modern critic or scholar would ever identify this work as a novel. That's right, despite the fact that it meets the textbook definition, and despite the fact that it bills itself as a novel, no one would now describe it as such. So why not? Why shouldn't a work originally billed as a novel continued to be identified as one? And if Haywood's work doesn't qualify, then what does, and why? These are great questions, closely related to our original inquiries about the definition of the novel form. Let's begin to search for answers in the opening paragraphs of Love in Excess. Just one more thing before we get to the paragraph, please. Haywood's narrator begins with a reference to the late war between the French and the Confederate armies. That would be the War of Spanish Succession, which ended in 1714. Okay, so here's the passage. In the late war between the French and the Confederate armies, the narrator tells us, there were two brothers who had acquired a more than ordinary reputation under the command of the great and intrepid Luxembourg. But the conclusion of the peace, taking away any further occasions of showing their valor, the eldest of them, whose name was Count Delmont, returned to Paris, from whence he had been absent 2 years, leaving his brother at Saint-Omer till the cure of some slight wounds were perfected. The fame of the Count's brave actions arrived before him, and he had the satisfaction of being received by the king and court after a manner that might gratify the ambition of the proudest. The beauty of his person, the gaiety of his air, and the unequaled charms of his conversation made him the admiration of both sexes, and whilst those of his own strove which should gain the largest share of his friendship, the other vented fruitless wishes, and in secret cursed that custom which forbids women to make a declaration of their thoughts. Let's stop there for now, noticing that some of the work's themes are potentially quite interesting. Consider, for example, the relationship between war and courtship or seduction. Now that the war's over, the Count needs further occasions of showing his valor. He's been doing it on the battlefield, and now he'll be doing it where? In society, with the ladies? How is this going to work out? And what about the women he's meeting? They're struck by his beauty and charm, and they'd like to say so, but unfortunately they can't, since custom forbids it. Exactly what thoughts would they declare if they could? Something gives me the feeling that they're at least as interested in the Count's person, that is his body, as they are in his conversation. So here we've got men and women who share an interest in getting together. We've also got a situation in which only the men are permitted to express that desire. Very interesting. Now, how will Haywood's people cope with this situation? Will they find a way to get what they want from each other? Let's return to the passage and see what it tells us. Amongst the number of these women was Eliza, a lady descended by the father's side from the noble family of de la Tour, formerly Lord of Beaugé, and by her mother's from the equally illustrious house of Montmorency. The late death of her parents had left her co-heiress with her sister of a vast estate. Let's stop there for a moment. We've now got a new character, Eliza, and we know that she fancies the Count. We also know that she's from a noble family and is co-heiress of a vast estate. Let's see what else we learn about these two characters, the Count and Eliza, looking for signs that they may end up together. We'll resume the quotation. Eliza, if her passion was not greater than the rest, her pride and the good opinion she had of herself made her the less able to support it. She sighed, she burned, she raged, when she perceived the charming Delmont behaved himself toward her with no mark of a distinguishing affection. What, said she, have I beheld without concern 1,000 lovers at my feet, and shall the only man I ever endeavored or wished to charm regard me with indifference? Wherefore has the agreeing world joined with my deceitful glass to flatter me into a vain belief I had invincible attractions? Delmont sees them not. Delmont is insensible. Then would she fall into ravings, sometimes cursing her own want of power, sometimes the coldness of Delmont. Many days she passed in these inquietudes, and every time she saw him, which was very frequently either at court, at church, or public meetings, she found fresh matter for her troubled thoughts to work upon. That seems like another great place to stop. Eliza is not especially passionate, it turns out, but she is very proud, and she wants Delmont for herself, all to herself. After reporting all of that to us, the narrator gives us a sampling of her thoughts, and though the feelings are intense enough, the language feels stilted. Wherefore has the agreeing world joined with my deceitful glass, and on, Even for 1719, that's a bit much. Now, as we finish this opening, you might ask yourself about Haywood's characterization of Delmont and Eliza. What does she tell us, really tell us, about these two characters, and what else might we want to know? She does go on to explain a few things. On occasion, Delmont does seem to hint at stronger feelings for Eliza. Unfortunately for her, he does the very same thing with almost everyone else. So as it turns out, his behavior is not the result of love, but rather of his generally pleasant disposition, and naturally this only adds to Eliza's frustrations. Here's how the narrator wraps it up. The impatient Eliza, disdaining to be ranked with those whom her vanity made her consider as infinitely her inferiors, suffered herself to be agitated almost to madness between the two extremes of love and indignation. Love on the one side, indignation on the other. She's torn. 1,000 chimeras came into her head, and sometimes prompted her to discover the sentiments she held in his favor. But those resolutions were rejected almost as soon as formed, and she could not fix on any for a long time, till at last love, ingenious in invention, inspired her with one, which probably might let her into the secrets of his heart without the shame of revealing her own. So, as it turns out, Haywood's opening paragraphs, and here we can sum up, tell us relatively little about these characters. There's almost nothing that would distinguish Delmont from any other dashing nobleman. And as for Eliza, we see that she's vain and selfish, but we don't really know why. Have past experiences shaped her attitudes, or was she just born that way? In Haywood's defense, one might argue that it's early yet. We've really only gotten to page 3. And that's fair enough. Yet if you were to finish the rest of this book, you still wouldn't have a strong, sharp sense of the characters. To be sure, some of the major themes are developed in interesting ways. Take, for example, the theme of sex and sexual desire. The dominant assumption in our culture often seems to be that men feel such things more keenly than women. In Haywood, there's absolutely no difference. Both men and women are driven by powerful sexual desires. What's more, they all experience these desires as sort of completely possessing. They take over the very soul of these people. Love creates intolerable torments, unspeakable joys, says the narrator at one point, kind of summing up this idea. Raises us to the highest heaven of happiness, or sinks us to the lowest level of misery. Nevertheless, in spite of these interesting features, it remains true that, even by the end of this work, it's hard to describe Haywood's characters in any but the most basic terms. Nothing about them seems particularly distinctive. Now, to wrap up this point, I'd just like to quote 2 speeches from the novel. And as I do, I hope you'll see that they sound more or less the same. Neither of them gives us a distinctive voice or a particular point of view. Here, then, is a speech given by Delmont to one of the women. As you'll see, he's finally fallen for someone. Why, my life, my angel, he says, my everlasting treasure of my soul, should these objections now be raised? How can you say that you have given me your heart? Nay, own you think me worthy that inestimable jewel, yet dare not trust your person with me a few hours? So there's the first speech from Delmont. Now here's the next one, given by another woman, much later in the book, to Delmont. She says to him, Heavens, are then my charms so mean, my darts so weak, that near they cannot intercept those shot at such a distance? And are you that dull coal Platonist which can prefer the visionary pleasures of an absent mistress to the warm transports of the substantial present? At this point, I hope you're beginning to see why Haywood's work, interesting and important though it is, doesn't really conform to current understandings and definitions of the novel. For us, the novel is a form associated with specificity, particularity, and concreteness, especially in the portrayal of major characters, and those qualities just aren't present in Love and Excess. To get a sense of what's missing from Love in Excess and what's typically present in a good novel, let's turn our attention to another set of passages. This set comes from Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, a work originally published in 1876. Daniel Deronda was Eliot's last novel, appearing about 4 years after Middlemarch, the work widely regarded as her masterpiece. The novel has many interesting features, not the least of which is the presence, rather unusual in Victorian fiction, of several Jewish characters. One of the most important relationships in the novel is the one between Daniel Deronda and Gwendolen Harleth. Daniel lays eyes on Gwendolen in the novel's very first scene, and here's how that scene begins. Was she beautiful or not beautiful? And what was the secret of form or expression which gave the dynamic quality to her glance? Was the good or evil genius dominant in those beams? Probably the evil. Else, why was the effect that of unrest rather than of undisturbed charm? Why was the wish to look again felt as coercion and not as a longing in which the whole being consents? 5 questions, then, broken up with a single statement, probably the evil. Gwendolen hasn't been described yet. We don't even know her name, but we already understand that her looks are mysterious. The questioner is also of interest to us here. Technically, the questions must come from a third-person narrator, yet partly because we can't imagine why such a narrator wouldn't already know the answers, we must assume that the real questioner is another one of the characters. We don't know who he might be either. So there's lots packed in here. And as the next few paragraphs unfold, we get even more details. The scene takes place inside a casino in the late afternoon. About 50 or 60 people are crowded around the gaming table, and the young woman in question has a graceful figure and a middle-aged companion. She's also on a winning streak, or at least she has been, until Daniel sets his eyes upon her. He seems to put the evil eye on her. That's the narrator's phrase, by the way, and she quickly loses a couple of bets. Now let's pick up the passage at this point. Her friend touched her elbow and proposed that they should quit the table. For reply, Gwendolen put 10 louis on the same spot. Since she was not winning strikingly, the next best thing was to lose strikingly. She controlled her muscles and showed no tremor of mouth or hands. Each time her stake was swept off, she doubled it. So this time, the setting is detailed and specific. This is not just any old place, but a particular place, namely a fashionable casino. Similarly, these are not just stock figures who behave and speak in predictable ways. Indeed, the whole point of the passage is that Gwendolen and Daniel aren't like other people. She eventually blows all of her winnings, mostly it seems because she wants him to see her do it. Now that's really weird, and we immediately want to know more about a person who would do that sort of thing. This, then, is the novel, a form that usually means to show us a particular place at a particular time, maybe even a particular moment in history, a form designed to acquaint us with individual people who think, speak, and interact in very specific ways. Novelists don't always live up to these values, of course. There are times when they rely on stock figures and formulaic plots. In fact, I sometimes wonder if novels don't actually need a few stock characters thrown into the mix, if only as a background against which to measure the development of the major figures. It's also true that stock figures can be handled well and even imaginatively. In a great comic novel like Tom Jones or Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, the predictability of some characters' behavior is crucial to the humor and indeed to the meaning of the novel. To be sure, the comparison of our two examples is more than a little unfair. George Eliot is one of the most accomplished novelists in the entire tradition, and Daniel Deronda has one of the very best openings of all time. Many critics would say, in fact, that the rest of the novel doesn't quite live up to the promise of that exciting opening scene in the casino. In spite of all that, I do think that the comparison is instructive. And I do want to emphasize that as the term novel is redefined in the 18th and 19th centuries, And as that term is passed on to us, most authors and most critics agree to shoot for the target set up by people like George Eliot. They agree that a novel should look more like Daniel Deronda than like Love in Excess. The setting should be realistic, not generic, and the major characters should be particular individuals, not familiar types. So what then would critics have us do with Love in Excess? How do they think it should be classified or characterized? And how would they explain the evolution of the novel form in the period between Haywood, 1720s, and Eliot, 1870s? Such questions will occupy us for the rest of our course. For now, as an initial response, we might note that for an increasing number of current scholars, and there is a growing interest in writers like Haywood, works like Love in Excess are best identified as amatory tales or amatory fictions. The term amatory tale, which Haywood would never have heard or used herself, helps to distinguish works like Love in Excess from works written even 25 years later. Such works would include Pamela by Samuel Richardson or Evelina by Frances Burney. Despite their occasional failings, Pamela and Evelina clearly count as novels by current standards. More often than not, these works are trying to particularize and specify. That's not true of Love in Excess for all of the reasons we've noted, and we need a term that indicates as much. The term amatory tale is useful for another reason, since it points to the most interesting feature of Haywood's story, the theme of love and sexual passion, and makes that feature the defining feature. With this new term in hand, scholars have also been able to show that there were lots of amatory tales published in the period from, say, 1680 to 1740. The original source of these works may have been an anonymous French narrative from the late 17th century called the Portuguese Letters. In these letters, as one scholar explains, a seduced and abandoned nun evokes her passionate affair with a cavalier. So scholars have been working to separate and distinguish the amatory tale or amatory fiction from the later form of the novel. Having done that, they've also sought to distinguish it from an earlier form called the romance. The romance is a very, very old form indeed. It may date back to antiquity, though the most familiar examples are probably the medieval stories of King Arthur and his knights. Romances vary widely, but they do have some common features. The setting of a romance is usually remote and maybe exotic. Like that of a fairy tale, in fact, the setting of a romance may be vague. England or France, back in the days of chivalry. That's usually enough. The characters in a romance are also sketched broadly. Handsome prince, beautiful princess, and may include larger-than-life figures such as giants and wizards. And if that makes you think of Harry Potter, that's just fine. I'd say that the Potter books are a cross between the traditional romance and the more modern form of the novel. Finally, and this is maybe another reason to think of Harry, there's often some sort of magic in a romance. The romance is a form that has no trouble with the supernatural or the metaphysical. Such things are much, much more problematic in the form of the novel, by the way. The distinctions between the romance and the amatory tale, or for that matter the amatory tale and the novel, are by no means absolute. Indeed, scholars have shown that the romance was stripped down and streamlined into the amatory tale. Romances could go on for thousands of pages, while amatory tales usually wrap things up in a couple of hundred. Similarly, it's clear that the amatory tale formed the basis for early novels like Pamela. We'll discuss Pamela in detail in later lectures, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. At this point, it'll be enough to say that the amatory tales provided Richardson with some basic elements and that he worked to complicate them in his own writings. Thus, in addition to all those definitions of novel, amatory tale, and romance, we've also got a chronology. First, the romance is stripped down and streamlined into the amatory tale. Next, the amatory tale is developed and complicated, transformed into the very first novels. Surely, it's not quite as simple as that. For one thing, the forms of the romance and amatory tale haven't been superseded by the novel. They're both still with us, really. I've already suggested that the Harry Potter books are drawing on the long tradition of the romance, and I'd say the same thing about the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Star Wars movies. In fact, the opening line from the very first movie, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away," gives you a really good sense of how the romance likes to operate. As for the amatory tale, it too remains alive and well. Consider, for example, the career of Dame Barbara Cartland, who is said to have produced 700 different love stories in the latter half of the 20th century. In sorting out these possibilities, now and throughout the course, we'll want to remember that the novel began as a popular form, the kind of writing that ordinary people could enjoy, so there's nothing inappropriate about comparisons to Harry Potter or Barbara Cartland. In this lecture, we've tried to develop a feel for what might be called the novelistic. If we haven't emerged with a hard and fast definition of the form, we may at least have gained a sense of its relationships to other writing. We may also have gotten an answer to the question of why Fielding calls Tom Jones a history instead of a novel. In his day, and here we're talking about the late 1740s, the term novel is still strongly associated with works like Love in Excess, and Fielding wanted to distinguish his work from that kind of fiction. In the next lecture, we'll go on to refine and extend our understanding of the novel form, considering its two major dimensions, the sociological and the psychological. We'll also begin to explore the most distinctive features of the English novel tradition, contrasting works by Charles Dickens and Honoré de Balzac.